This is the Chicks of FinTwit, a finance podcast by women for everyone. I am your host, Caitlin Cook. Join me as I highlight female trailblazers and their male allies across the industry as each shares their expertise on a variety of finance topics. Nothing is off limits. Thanks for joining us. Now please enjoy this episode.
All opinions expressed by Caitlin Cook and the Chicks of FinTwit podcast guests are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinions of the host or any of their affiliates. This podcast is for informational purposes only, is not investment advice, and should not be relied upon for any investment decisions. We are not recommending any securities, nor is this an offer or sale of a security.
Hello and welcome to the Chicks of FinTwit podcast, a finance podcast by women for everyone. I am your host, Caitlin Cook, and otherwise known as Dead Kate Bounce on Twitter. And with us today, we have Jessica Schaefer, founder and CEO of Bevel. Jessica, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, really excited to have you here. So for those who don't know you, who is Jessica Schaefer? So maybe just a description of your background and maybe a kind of just leading us up to how you came to founding Bevel to begin with.
Sure. So I started working in financial communications in 2008, which was, sort of a freak crash course into financial comms. And from there, I actually did my MBA in investing, wanted to go into investment banking, but everyone told me you have personality. So you should definitely stay in PR. And that's proven to be true. I went on to work at Moody's and rebrand them from the subprime mortgage crisis, which they were largely blamed for. And then I actually went into institutional sales. So I was working with Goldman, Mizuho, RBS, RBC, selling structured finance and credit risk models to the back office, which is quite lucrative, but not very exciting. And then I joined Point72, Steve Cohen's $20 billion hedge fund. It was then a family office, and worked with them when Point72 was a new brand, and taking them from what happened with SAC Capital to the comeback story. So that was one of the most fascinating things I've worked on in my career. And then I also launched their venture capital fund, Point72 Ventures. And that was when I started to get the bug, I guess, for technology and tech communications. This was in 2017 before, fintech investing really started to take off, and worked with a number of the companies in his portfolio, one of them being Acorns. And the founder was like, oh my God, what you did in 3 days, no one has done in 3 years. Would you want to come and join? And that was a common sort of thread among the CEOs, and they all wanted me to join to work on their communications. So I thought, why don't I end up starting my own consultancy? And that's when I founded Bevel.
Love it. And let's talk a little bit more about Bevel, right? So with your background, like you just talked about working for Point72, among others, what kind of made you realize the need for, specialized PR in this space? Was it just by way of your background? Was it something specific you saw within the financial services industry, or a little bit of both?
Well, in 2017, there was something like about 20 billion being invested in fintech. And now if you fast forward to today, there's almost 150 billion being invested in fintech. And so I sort of saw that everything was moving in that way. And I'm always somebody who wants to be ahead of the curve. And so I was very interested in working in that industry. I also saw that there was a huge lack of knowledge about the space. So most people who go into communication, they sort of want to do beauty or consumer. There are not a lot of people who say, I want to do fintech PR. That's just like not a sentence that comes out of anyone's mouth. And so you'll hear a lot about founders who are unhappy working with their existing PR firm. They feel like they don't understand the product. They don't understand the narrative. And if you don't understand something you're selling, it's really hard to get results. So I felt like there was a huge opportunity to build a different kind of communications consultancy, one where we hired people from outside of PR, people who worked at McKinsey and Goldman, who worked in SEO in different industries, or maybe they were an analyst, but again, they just had that general or like special ability to storytell. And those are the people we hire to Bevel.
Well, I'm excited to talk a little bit more about your team, but sort of to piggyback off of part of what you were mentioning, right? I mean, having that specialty within the financial services space, working within it, going to college for finance and kind of hearing feedback from people where I'm from a really small town, right? And there's a big, misconception or generalization of financial services industry for a lot of people who don't work in it. And maybe that stemmed from 2008. Maybe it was before, I'm not sure, maybe a little bit of both. But I think there's a really important role for PR specifically within this industry, just because of a lot of the common, misconceptions and generalizations that people have about finance. Have you found that to be true?
Yeah, I mean, I think transparency was definitely needed in financial services and was what led to a lot of the issues that we had. And now companies are trying to course correct that. And I would say the newer firms that you're seeing and the ones that we're launching, they're being more transparent and communicating more than ever. So the marketing budgets are high, the PR budgets are high. And it's really a way to build trust with the customer, or if you're a B2B company, just communicating what your services are and what you're offering. So I think communications is tremendously important. And it's what has allowed us to build a lot of high growth brands and approach customer acquisition in a slightly different way.
Love it. And I know you mentioned Fintech specifically, but not only do you represent, Fintech companies, you also represent some of the funds as well that are responsible for supplying capital to those startup companies or Fintech companies, right? So from your unique vantage point, and I think Bevel sort of covers the spectrum across Fintech, financial services, and different types of funds and whatnot in terms of who you work with. What are some of the biggest trends you've seen across those industries, just getting that, 1,000-foot view across the whole space rather than working with just one little pocket of that? I'm guessing you get a lot of exposure to a lot of different things.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. So we started with Fintech, and then we grew, and we were very early on, Greycroft. They were our third client, and Alan Patrickoff, who's the founder of Venture Capital. We just started seeing where all of the venture funds were putting their money in. And we're really at a unique intersection point across venture, media, tech, and now celebrities. So we've seen like the full spectrum of the gambit. We have like The Rock, who's an investor in one of our companies, the chain smokers. And so it's been fun to work on the more institutional side. So representing, some of the major PE funds, hedge funds, and venture funds, and then all the way to working with people like J-Lo. And you really get to see where people are putting their money and why. We also saw that the checks were getting bigger and bigger. And now that there's been so many new players and entrants into Fintech, we're starting to see this massive consolidation across the industry. So companies are competing for the customer. They want to be the super app where you can go and have sort of like the one-stop shop for Fintech or whatever it is. And I think it's sort of been interesting to even see some of our clients buying each other. So
I think an interesting part of that you mentioned too is like working with celebrities. I had Nicole Casperson on previously on the podcast who works in reporting for Fintech. And that's something that she always mentions is we've seen within the space sort of an intersection of finance and culture stronger than ever before, where, public figures, celebrities, athletes are all getting involved in the mix, specifically in investing as well, right? Putting their money into a lot of these companies, specifically within Fintech too. I think that's, something that we've seen continue to build out and something we'll continue to see moving forward a little bit more than we have in the past, just because it seems like everything is really starting to overlap. I think that with COVID as well, that we've seen more people getting into investing, right? People are stuck at home. People are opening up accounts at Coinbase or opening up accounts at Robinhood. And, maybe celebrities have noticed that trend as well and wanted to get involved in the mix too.
Well, and now I think it's easier than ever to start your own investing fund, there's so many different tech platforms, whereas before it was sort of an archaic process. No one really understood it. And now I think anyone who has a unique perspective has become more and more relevant as a strategic investor versus, I wouldn't say just a venture fund, but someone who's just putting capital in.
Yeah. And to your point on even building out your team, which I'd love to talk about more because it is a female team, right? So what I love that you mentioned, bringing in people from different backgrounds, because I think especially in investing, right, to your point, people from different backgrounds, I think it's advantageous to have that, because if we're all coming from the same knowledge base, if we're all being taught the same things, we're all going to have the same perspective. So I do think there's an edge from an investing standpoint coming from a different background. And you probably see that on the PR side of things as well within your team. We do, but we also have men in the female-led team. Female-led team. In the beginning, it was interesting. We hired a lot of women, and then some of the guys who we were interviewing with, they're like, I just need to know, are there only women at this company? So we definitely have more representation now, which is great. But yeah, I think working with a diversity of backgrounds and opinions, especially when you're in communications, is super important. And when you're working with a variety of different companies across sectors and industries, you really need to understand how they're approaching their customer and who their customer is. So if the firm looks all the same, it's really difficult to do that. And the firms you're representing don't all look the same, right? So diversity of thought is definitely super important. And for the people listening, right? So working within the financial services space as well, what would be, PR 101, your biggest pieces of advice when it comes to formulating a PR strategy? I guess for way of background for me, I came from a larger global financial services firm. I work for a tech startup now, or a fintech startup now. And it's very interesting to see the difference in approach to PR, where people are at in the process of having a PR strategy set up, whether they do or not, and how they approach the communication side of things is super important. But I think sometimes we don't think about it until there's some crisis management that might come out, and we realize we do need PR, and it's a super important part of the space that I think deserves some love. So what would your 101 advice be when it comes to formulating a PR strategy? Well, first of all, we love working on crisis. It's super fun, but it's always better if you already have a really strong communications partner in place, somebody you trust and will actually listen to, because in a crisis, that the number one thing is sort of getting out of your own way and not reacting emotionally. In terms of how to think about a PR strategy, I think the first thing and what we do differently is we don't take on every single company that approaches us. So we probably look at 300, I call them deals because we tend to take equity in some of these firms, but 300 deals a year, and we only work with 10% of them. And the reason is I don't believe everyone needs PR. And so sometimes you should ask yourself, is this an ego thing? Is that why I want PR? Or is it really going to fundamentally change my business strategy and what I'm working on? And so if the answer is in the latter, then it makes sense. We look at three things. One, if you are a first-time founder and you don't have a media profile, it's going to be a challenge. And so are you creating something on the product side that is unique and interesting that we haven't seen before, and you're just creating a completely new category? If that's the case, then we can build a media strategy around it. The second thing is a second or third time founder. We like to see that they have some sort of track record. And then the third thing, if they don't have any of those, is do you have an interesting network of investors and advisors who would be willing to speak on your behalf in the early stages of a brand? Because that is critical in terms of getting things going. So we want it to go from a very proactive, we're calling people constantly, to a reactive strategy where we can be a little bit more strategic when the brand has reached, a sort of
tipping point. And if you don't have those things, then we tend to turn clients away, which is a hard conversation to have, but I think it'll save founders, countless hours and a lot of money and resources that could probably be better spent on other things. I think, in the beginning, especially in B2B, you might want to focus more of your time on actually building the product and getting some high profile customers that we can then talk about to the media.
Yeah. And that's a super important point, right? We always talk about how to find clients, how to acquire clients and whatnot, and working with different firms, but we don't enough talk about, being picky about who we do work with. And that's, protecting your time, protecting the resources of your firm as well. So I think that's super important. When it comes to helping the business model, I kind of was typing out the 3 different, scenarios you wrote out in which you would be more willing to work with a firm, right? And the first one being, love to run through these a little bit more, but with first-time founders, right? Without a media profile, essentially, I would say from this list, to not put words in your mouth, but starting a little bit more from scratch, right? If there's a founder that doesn't have a media profile, has never been a founder before, right? Has a product that is interesting, but is new. Where do you start with that? That seems like, I guess, a lot. Do you start with more of the founder as the individual? Do you stay more on the product side and focusing on, the interesting product in the category that it's within? I'm guessing it might be a bit of both, but curious for your thoughts there.
So it's usually a combination of both. I really love sitting down with a founder in a neutral, sort of fun setting where they can get really comfortable, talk about how they grew up, what led you to become a founder. I think, entrepreneurs by nature, there's something there. There's not a lot of people who are just like, oh, I want to leave this amazing job to start my own company. So what drove you to do that? And what is your mission? What is your vision? Why are you pounding the pavement to try to create something? And then once we have that, it's much easier to sell that to the media versus if we're just pitching product that if it's a new category, people might not understand. And so you have to spend just as much time with reporters and actually build and develop the relationship as you would when you're securing financing. So I think there's this idea that, and I see it all the time, founders will approach us and say, I have to announce next week or whatever, which is crazy. I'm like, why do you have to announce next week? What are you actually announcing? This makes no sense. Does somebody have a gun to your head? Because if not, let's take the time, build out your narrative, build out, 3 to 4 key messages that you want to own in the media all the time, no matter what. And so then it goes from traditional media relations to awards, conferences, custom events, working with influencers, and making sure we're engaged on every single platform, but we're sharing the same story.
And when you have, second, third, fourth time founders, which is crazy for me to think about, right? Doing that time and time again and coming back for more, which I love. Definitely a certain type for founders that you see continuously doing this, which is great. Where's the difference in strategy there, right? Because I guess you're coming from a bit of a more established base, probably from someone a little bit more quote unquote prominent and has been building time and time again, right? As you mentioned, where's the difference in strategy on that?
Well, so part of that challenge is I found a lot of the founders who, build their second or third company, it's always in a different industry. So rarely are they building the same thing. And so there's a little bit of some work that needs to be done on shifting their image or rebuilding them in a different industry. And so I think an executive who is patient is really important. Right now, we're actually working with the former CEO of Wealthfront, and he's launched a charitable giving platform called Daffy. He was not in charitable giving before, right? And so it's like shifting and rebuilding or even building some new relationships for him that he just doesn't have. And anyone would want to talk to him about Wealthfront, which was just acquired by UBS. But now we have to start getting into those philanthropic conversations, which is a very different place.
No, that makes sense. And when you talked about on the last part too, with having an interesting network, I guess, can you elaborate on what you mean by that? I know, it probably helps with coming from different backgrounds, having the different firms that want to work with you, I think speaks a lot to the product that you're building and the people that you've brought in as well. But curious what you meant by that.
So we're about to launch this one company right now, which I can't mention the name yet, but they have support from Andreessen, and they also have support from the chain smokers. And so that's very different. Similarly, we launched a new travel app called Elude, where you can basically search by price and your budget versus where you want to go. So it makes traveling super affordable to anyone. And it's a cool idea. It's a cool platform. They have the co-founder of Priceline on their board. And so that was the first person we spoke to before we even signed them to understand, why do you think, you built one of the largest traveling platforms in the world? What makes this the next one? And I think that's important for them to have, because they've never spoken with anyone in the media. We were really starting from ground zero, but because we had this other person in our back pocket, it just made it that much easier to build the brand.
Right. And it's sort of like a credibility, right? You have buy-in from people who have been in the space. You have buy-in from people who are very well established in finding companies that, are building really interesting things in interesting markets that haven't been done before as well. So that makes a lot of sense. So you talk about kind of where you start with Bevel when, 300 different, opportunities come up a year, which is incredible. And working with 10% of those, but you gave a bit of where you do start when it comes to PR. Where are sort of the common misconceptions that people have about PR and where they most easily go wrong that you found, generally speaking?
I think people think that immediately they'll get a feature story or that it's easily trackable for conversions, and it's not. Building a brand is when somebody is talking to their friend and they're like, oh, have you heard of this really cool new app, Rally? Like, did you know you could buy a piece of a Lamborghini or a Birkin bag? And then, when the friend goes back and then they download the app and they become an investor, you can't track that. It's like when somebody is, saying like, oh, have you been to the hottest new restaurant in town? That's PR. And so when people, I think marketing budgets are easily justifiable because you're buying customers. But when you're building a brand, you're building loyalty, you're building trust. And what we've seen from, our clients who really get it, they're over indexing on PR, and they're actually spending less on some of the channels that have become really super saturated. So like Instagram, you're constantly getting spammed with ads, or you're seeing every single influencer across all the apps that you follow, they're seeing the same thing in a different message, and everyone's paying them the same rate. So it's really hard to build like a unique identity if you're only pulling on some of those platforms.
Yeah. And that's such a good point, right? I mean, we're living in an age where it's just constantly having things thrown in front of you, right? And the attention span for each of those is probably pretty short unless it's something that you're really interested in diving into, right? And so many different influencers and personalities, and it's sort of information overload, right? So I guess to your point there, when it comes to, providing or building out a brand in the face of all of that, it has to be really challenging, right? I mean, I've been trying to help my firm with that on my side. So from a more amateur angle, I can say that it's definitely not easy. But from yours, with all of the experience that you have, I mean, how does one do that successfully? Because I think, to your point, there are a lot of distractions and it's really hard to stand out.
I think it's important to work closely with the CEO, but also with the marketing team and creating moments and really interesting creative campaigns versus just talking about your company. So for example, like when public.com did this really interesting marketing drop with Airbnb, they did like this cereal box that was called IPO Oats. And they sent it to all the influencers, and then you saw it was trending everywhere. And then we got a bunch of different consumer media. And it was an interesting activation and campaign that was firing across all cylinders. So I think in order to cut through the noise, you really have to be confident and solid on your story and what it's going to be, but then also activating across all those channels.
I loved the cereal boxes when they sent those out. And the cool thing with that is even today, when you send something out that's just, physical, right? It's not native to the internet. It's not digital. You see this weird thing now where it's like, even if you send something out that's a physical gift or, like a care package or something like that, it's being shared across social media as well. So you sort of get like you get like the publicity from it either way, where it's, I don't know where I'm kind of going with that, but I saw pictures of the cereal boxes everywhere, right? So you can still take the more traditional approach of literally delivering something to someone's door and still get that digital exposure as well, which I think is a pretty interesting crossroads.
Yeah, I think people are really used to getting consumer products and a bunch of stuff in the mail, but especially in financial services, it's just still very rare. So we're actually hosting an event in Miami next weekend for Acorns. They just added a Bitcoin ETF to the product. And basically we're going to have, we're renting out this ice cream shop and we're going to do build your own sundae bit by bit. And it's introducing the idea of diversification and portfolio construction, where the base is going to be, the vanilla or chocolate. And that should be like your core investment strategy. That should take up the most amount. And then you're going to start to add all the different things that you want on your sundae, which should be a little bit less. So like 90% of your portfolio should be in something that's safer. And then 10% you can sort of play around with sprinkles or whatever in crypto and equities. So
I love that. It's making me hungry, but that's a great idea. That's great. And I guess the last one I want to go into, you being a founder yourself as well in this episode too, but kind of the last thing there, you mentioned a lot of working with companies who are delivering services that are more B2B, business to business. Where do you see I'm sure there's pretty stark differences in how you would approach working with a firm that is more B2B rather than like B2C and working directly with consumers. Kind of thousand foot view here. How do you approach those in different ways with the companies that you work with?
Sure. So on the B2B side, that's where we saw the most amount of activity in terms of M&A last year. So we worked with those clients from seed until they had a liquidity event. And then there were certain B2B companies who came in about a year out from when they were going to be acquired. And they really wanted to rev up their media profiles for their executive team. And we focused on a couple of things. One, how is the product different from any of their competitors? So every time a new feature would come out, like doing sort of this side by side of where they played in the market. And then two, it's really important if you want to sell your company as an executive that people actually know who you are. So on the B2B side, once you're reaching that sort of pivotal moment where you think you're going to sell, PR can be very valuable in increasing the valuation and potentially the size of the deal. So we focus a lot more on executive visibility. What have they built? Where did they come from? Those sorts of more feature type stories, like, the cover of Forbes or Fortune or whatever. So
makes sense. And speaking of executive visibility, so you yourself, right, founder and CEO, Bevel's very clearly killing it, right? But I love kind of peeling back the onion, talking about the beginning days. You alluded to it at the beginning of why, you were working with different firms that had wanted to bring you in to do communications, right? And you thought, maybe I'm onto something here. Maybe I should start something for myself. And could you talk a little bit more about the inception of Bevel? I guess I love hearing the stories of, where people start in building that out and kind of the struggles and the triumphs of the beginning days that people often don't talk about when, the company is standing strong, bigger team, and obviously doing really well like Bevel is today.
It was definitely, we were fortunate because we started with 3 clients. So by we, I mean me, and I had a laptop. And then I would go and meet with other venture funds and I would say, oh, we have, a team of 5 and this and that. And I was a little bit, I don't know if dramatic is the right word, but I would say that we had more people than we had. And then, we hired and we got our foot in the door at a lot of really amazing places. But we also charged what we were worth, and we never cut on pricing, even in the beginning. I think that really helped to differentiate the value and what we were providing. And I don't know, as a female founder, that everyone always does that. So that was important. What you end up giving up is all of your personal time. I don't think anything was really invested in that. So I'm happy that my friends and family have stuck around, because I was certainly, I was on a plane every other day. I was just trying to build the company, build the team, and that takes a lot of work.
Yeah, it's a lifestyle, right? It's not a 9 to 5. It is literally everything that you do, because if you don't, I feel like, startup companies, that we all see the statistics on, how many startup companies survive, right? And if you're not fully committed to that, then you're likely lowering your chances, I'd say. But why, I guess, there are far fewer female founders than men. We always see the stats on that, right? But did you have any unique challenges, I guess, as a woman? It's sort of hard to gauge that, right? With, you don't know if that's necessarily the reason sometimes in terms of, forming relationships and securing business and funding and whatnot. But curious if you had, some comments on your experience on that front.
I think on the business side, it's an advantage. And people want to work with female founders. Everyone is excited and very supportive of Bevel. So in my mind, especially in fintech, when there's no one else sort of who looks like me, that is very helpful. I think on the personal side, if you flip it, you can just become very exhausted. So just the number of meetings, because I was the only female founder in fintech in the room, like I'm invited to every single dinner. I'm invited to every single conference. Everybody's like, we need more females. We need more females. And as someone who said yes a lot of the time, which is something I'm working on, it could be exhausting. I think what women don't talk about, and what I think was sort of more frustrating, is, when people would say things like, well, why aren't you married yet? Or what's happening in your personal life? And now that I am married, the question is not, oh, how is Bevel doing? How is business? Which is what you would ask a male executive. It's like, when are you having kids? But it's a different set of questions that are asked of a female founder. And I think there's a lot of pressure when you hit a certain point where, I'm starting a venture fund right now, and we're going to be more strategic and double down on some of the investments that we've made in our companies. But then in the back of my mind, there's always like, okay, you're 35, you have to have babies now.
Yeah. And talk about added pressure when people are always asking those things. So I started to that point, right? Part of this podcast, I just want to give a platform to people that look like us, right? You see a lot of podcasts and you see a lot of the same guests. A lot of them are men, and they're great. But I want to provide a lot of visibility for women who are building wonderful things as well, you included. And another part of that is, hopefully there are some women listening to this that, feel inspired by some of the people that they listen to, or people that are younger than I am that, don't know what they want to do and don't know, how to do it. And hearing these conversations helps. So for anyone looking to follow in your footsteps, not even specific to PR per se, but just becoming a founder someday, can you speak to some of your biggest lessons and challenges that you've faced along the way so far?
I would say don't be scared to get on the phone with people you don't know. But when you do, make sure you're prepared, and make sure that you spend the time that's necessary to really understand what the ask is, and make sure the other person understands. And then from there, don't beat yourself up about things. I think as women, and you probably heard this before, but we tend to over internalize things, and the other person is really focused on themselves. They probably don't care, and they don't remember. So I would just say to move on, know your worth, know your value, and build the company that you want to build. The thing that you said earlier that I think is really important is learning how to protect your time, building out enough time. When you're an entrepreneur, you just have people calling you, slacking you, sending messages on Signal, emails. I mean, it's just like you feel like you need to respond right away and you don't. So make sure you preserve the time really for yourself and also for your family and friends.
I love it. And before we started recording this, we were talking about we need a platform for all of these different messaging apps so we can see it all in one place, just because it's so overwhelming so easily. I'm not a founder, but I still get overwhelmed by seeing my email and seeing my Twitter DMs and my text messages and everything like that. It's a lot, especially in addition to meetings where you're face to face with people, whether that's in person or on Zoom, just constantly talking. It definitely takes some energy out of you, to say the least.
I know. I feel like I can't talk anymore. No, but I mean, honestly, maybe we should start that company. If there was one platform where everything was there, it would just be amazing. So I'm available if you want to start that.
We start a company off of a podcast episode that has been brought up before. So maybe we just start a whole kind of startup incubator. Maybe we'll do that. If anyone at my current employer hears this, sorry, feel free to join. But you made some really important points there, right? And I think some of them are kind of more, females are more prone to these things, right? Where it's one of my favorite things that you've mentioned this whole episode too is, when you started Bevel and around pricing and knowing your worth and not settling on that. And I think that that's something just I have to pound into my own head. I feel like women constantly have to pound into their heads where it's if you're delivering a service or a product or anything that is of the quality that you think it is, right? Why are you settling? Because there's already enough people out there that can deliver something to someone else at the price that they want it at. And if they don't want the quality that you're providing at the price that you're offering it at, then I don't know if there's like a full appreciation for what you're doing, right? So you want to work with people who appreciate you. You want to work with people who appreciate what you bring to the table. And I really don't think you should settle on that. Same with working with clients that are, the right fit for you and what you're building.
Right. And I also think one last thing on why women should become CEOs or founders. It's really difficult to change society if you're not in a position of power. So I've seen, and I'm sure many people listening have seen this when they work internal, that, one female candidate was passed on an opportunity internally because she didn't have some level of experience or expertise, whereas somebody else was given that role. And I think as a female founder, it's important to me that I champion women's careers and put them in a position of power. And a position of power is when you're negotiating for things of value. So every single woman on this team, they know how to negotiate for equity. They know how to negotiate multi-million-dollar contracts. They know how to increase those contracts. And they also know if the client doesn't want to, even if we're servicing the account more, that it's okay if they go away, and they have my full blessing to do that. So, if you want to change the world, you can't sit in a room where everyone looks like you. And I most recently experienced that again, when I went on this YPO ski trip. It was me and all male founders. So it was like, I'm skiing is with 30 guys. And also find a partner who supports you. There's nothing worse than somebody who feels insecure by your success or who isn't supportive of what you're doing. And it's sort of just like, who are you with? What do you don't need that if you're going to build a company. So
amen to all of that, right? I mean, the support system part of it is huge. And also just, being in the room, being present, representing, all of the other women that maybe haven't had the opportunity to be in those rooms is really important, that you take that opportunity seriously and, pursue it to the fullest. So I love all of that. And to your point on negotiating, maybe we talk about that a little bit more. We have a little bit of time here. That's something that you see studies and feedback from different researchers all the time, right? Women have, generally speaking, of course, have a little bit of a harder time negotiating, less willing to negotiate, less willing to ask for something if they don't feel that they deserve it when it comes to salary and opportunities and whatnot. Do you have maybe a little bit more feedback on how to approach that and how you've helped your team specifically to go into that really strong?
It's interesting because when you compromise your worth is compromised, right? So we actually, this quarter has been the most amazing quarter we've ever had in the history of the firm. And managing our success has been a lot more difficult than managing fires, to be honest. So one thing we did is raise our rates across the board and have not gone back on that decision. And so when we're asking for these higher rates, obviously you have to prove the value a little bit more, but you also have to stand firm in what you're asking for. And what I found is men, or well, mostly men, they love negotiating. They just love to get a better rate. And sometimes like people say to me, oh, this is all that they can pay. So when a more junior employee will come to me, or senior, honestly, they'll be like, oh, well, this is what they can afford. And I say, okay, well, those are not our rates. So just tell them what our rates are. And if they say no, they say no. And I'll guarantee you in 6 months, they'll come back. And they always do. So
they always come back.
Always come back.
Right. Yeah. Like, I mean, I think that's the point of setting a standard, setting a price, right? I mean, it's not to go below it and to stoop from that. It's because you think that that's the price that you deserve to be paid for the work that you're doing. Right. And I really don't think you should compromise on that.
No, do not compromise.
Never. Well, I do want to start wrapping things up here, but I guess we talked about a lot of different things, right? For people who want to be a founder, for people trying to build out a PR strategy, what is your, I guess, if you had to give one last piece of advice for the people listening now on any of those things, what would it be?
On the PR side, just make sure you have enough time and you're really invested in it. Don't, hand it off to someone else because it's your story, it's your reputation, and it's your brand. So Google, until we invent something else, is not going away. And you really want to make sure that what you're communicating is truly unique to you. And it's hard when you give that off to a junior marketing person. So we don't work with any firms where we don't meet the founder because we want to make sure that one, they're truly invested in it and they say yes to opportunities. I mean, building a brand takes time. And if you're only giving one way, you have to give both ways for the relationship to really work.
Love it. Well, this was fantastic. And for everyone listening, I mean, I always ask the same things. You mentioned, obviously being a founder, it takes up pretty much most of your time, right? And building all of that out, managing relationships, building out a team and all of that. In your free time, I guess, outside of being a founder, CEO, what else do you like to do? What do you do in your free time if you ever happen to have it?
I love to ski. I'm a huge skier. I've skied, I think, on every continent. And I love to get outside and hike. I always have like the same sleeping routine. So I'll generally go to bed around 10 or 11 and wake up at 6 or 7. And then I work out in the mornings. And I really tried to make the mornings my time before I open the kimono to all those crazy communications that we're both at the forefront of. So
yeah, definitely need some time from that. And I'm a skier too. So I have to ask, where are your favorite places that you've skied?
I love Niseko in Japan. It's amazing. It's in Hokkaido. It's just like the most amount of snow I've ever seen. It snows every single day. And then A Basin in Colorado, it's sort of like, the mountain towns, everybody's out there barbecuing with their dogs. It's like super chill, but the verticals are insane. So
love it. Well, I'm adding those to my list right now. Well, thank you so much. Where can everyone listening follow you, follow Bevel? If anyone business wise is looking to get in touch with Bevel, where would they follow you and contact you for that?
Sure. So everyone can follow us on Instagram at Bevel PR. You can also just shoot me an email, jessica@bevelpr.com. We are aggressively hiring across a number of roles because we currently have a wait list of 50 clients. So if you're somebody who just loves fintech and you've thought about going into communications or marketing, even if you don't have the experience, we have a very amazing and wonderful training program. So we can basically teach you from the ground up.
Love it. And I love the training part of that. So anyone listening that is looking to get into that, this is the perfect opportunity. Jessica, thank you one more time. This was fantastic. And thank you to everyone for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode.
Thank you.